Oculus by Thistle Fox. Chapter 5. Dig Deep. There were so many moments in life Tweak wished he could relive. If he had that second chance, he could have conquered the demons infesting his torn mind and set everything right again. He always felt that way, since the moment Craig vanished from the sidewalk. After all it would have taken to spare Craig from his unending misery would have been a few simple words, a show of concern, a casual suggestion. If only he walked Craig home. If only he insisted on a sleepover. That was all he had to do. He didn't know Craig was one sentence away from salvation. So instead of all those things he could have done, all he did was say goodbye. A single breath was all Tweak needed to sacrifice to save Craig's life, but he found out a day too late. The only thing that distanced him from Craig's salvation was time. Sadly, Tweak did not have a time machine. All he had were his words. Words, it seemed, nobody wanted to hear. Nobody, including his best childhood friends, Token and Clyde. They had been together for as long as Tweak could recall. It was always the four of them, including Craig. They were an impenetrable force, an unshakable alliance of truth and true loyalty. Through hell and high water, their four-man show ruled the world with no questions asked. So naturally, Tweak confided in his best friends. He told them about the vivid visions in his dreams, the arrival of their mangled friend, and how urgent it was for someone to find him. It was painfully obvious they didn't believe a word Tweak spoke, but they listened. They listened because they loved him. Despite all the bullies and school counselor visits he'd accumulated in those few months, they still loved him. At least, that's what he thought until one miserable day in 7th grade. That morning, he was scuttling towards Clyde's locker with his head down. He and Craig met up with his friends there every day before class started. That didn't change after Craig's death. Tweak held his books tightly against his chest as he approached his friends. He could see Clyde's jersey jacket through the crowd, Token's purple hoodie too. However, there was something different about this morning. There was a guy at Clyde's locker. It was a new kid Tweak barely recognized. The kid's name and face eventually was lost to time, seeing as how he only went to their school for a year of junior high. Anxious, Tweak stood behind Token and waited for the unwelcome intruder to leave. "It's a Sunday. I'm pretty much inviting everybody, so feel free to spread it around," the kid said as he nodded his head. "We can totally come, yeah," Clyde replied excitedly to the foreign face. "Alright, cool," the other rejoiced. "Oh, but don't you hang out around that psychotic kid? The one who thinks he sees dead people or something? Let's kind of forget to tell him about it, alright?" The look on Tweak's face must have been heartbreaking. "What, you mean Tweak?" Token asked with his brows furrowed. It almost seemed like he was going to defend his friend, but another voice chimed in before he could speak. "You're kidding me, right? I wouldn't worry. That freak just kinda hangs around us for some reason. We just haven't had the heart to tell him to leave us alone yet." Tweak could practically feel his heart crush between the teeth of those hurtful words. Clyde's hurtful words. "Alright, cool," said the unnamed boy that, to Tweak, was never worth remembering. "See you then." As the kid walked away, Token gave Clyde a scornful look. "Oh, come on," Clyde whined before turning around to close his locker. "It's not like Tweak's gonna..." He stopped. A familiar face stared back at him from around Token's arm. The look Tweak was wearing said it all. Clyde's cheeks drained of color. He'd been caught. and he knew there was no smoothing it over. Token watched in silent shock as his friends stared blankly at one another. Tweak finally broke the perturbed silence with, You really think I'm a freak? Well, Clyde looked into his locker as he thought about what he should say. I mean, maybe freak was a little harsh, but... But what? Tweak demanded. His round eyes brimmed faintly with bitter water. Clyde sighed, then ran a hand through his brown hair. He always did that right before he was about to come out with something. I'm just tired, he admitted while shaking his head. I'm tired of all the stuff you say, and all the things you do. It's like everything's gotta be so complicated. It was bearable before, but nobody even wants to sit with us anymore because all you ever do is make up stuff about Craig. Tweak shook his head, hard. But I'm not making it up. Finally, all the frustration Clyde had been harboring all that time came exploding out of him. He truly was so tired, and he just couldn't listen to all the bullshit anymore. Stop lying, Tweak. You don't know what happened to Craig. Nobody does. Yes, I do, Tweak insisted, putting a heavy weight on each word he spat out of his mouth. He told me. He showed it to me when I was asleep. Do you even listen to yourself? You don't see ghosts, Tweak. They aren't real. Craig was an actual person. Your friend, who fucking disappeared. Do you have any idea how disrespectful it is to use him as some character for your little ghost stories? Tweak was so taken aback by what his friend was saying, he didn't know how to respond. His hands were shaking violently, and it felt like his heart was a kettle drum Clyde was beating on. He looked to Token, who was always the peacemaker when things went haywire. All Token did was look down at his feet with a damning expression. He agreed with Clyde. What? No, it's not like that. By that point, hallway traffic stopped almost completely. Clyde and Tweak were so absorbed in their anger and confusion that they didn't notice the silence hidden under their screaming. Sure, it's not. Just like that man in the attic, right? You think saying all these crazy things will make you seem cool? Well, it fucking doesn't. It makes you look like a freak. There it was again. That word that left Tweak's eyes stinging and his mouth dry. Freak. You think I would use losing Craig as some kind of leverage for a lie? He was my best friend. I can't run away from him like you can. I can't ever forget him like you can. Tweak spat, his face dangerously close to Clyde's. Suddenly, there was a low rumble of chanting that seeped between the warring friends. It came from their crowd of peers. Fight, they chimed mindlessly. Fight. Shut up, just shut up. The only thing you ever cared about was being the center of attention. You even had to go and make what happened to Craig all about you. You're a leech, Tweak. A leech. That's not true. Tweak protested through budding tears. He fisted the front of Clyde's jersey jacket in his trembling hands, begging to be believed or understood. All I want is somebody to make him stop hurting. Please, Clyde, please believe me. That was the last straw for Clyde. The chants from the crowd became more and more bloodthirsty. They wanted a show, and Tweak's fists were clutching the front of his jacket. He grabbed Tweak's wrist and shoved him away, harder than he'd meant to. Tweak stumbled back and painfully rammed his shoulder into a locker. The sound reverberated through the metal, just like Craig's low hissing reverberated through Tweak's skull. The students surrounding them let out startled screams as lights above Clyde flickered and cracked before bursting with an ear-shattering pop. For a short moment, everyone was silent with shock, but it wasn't over. Clyde took a step back in surprise, and every locker in the hallway that hung open was violently slammed closed by an unseen force. Loose papers flew, and the lights went haywire. Tweak was just as afraid as everyone else who witnessed the violent outburst. His fear only grew as thick black goo dripped from the ceiling and onto his shirt. He looked up to a disgusting sight. Craig was latched onto the ceiling above him. Tweek realized no one else saw him. Everyone was looking at Tweek with horrified expressions rather than the ghost hanging above their heads. That was the day that turned Tweek's life into a solitary hell. That was the day their fear began. He wobbled to his feet. As he stood, everyone near him scrambled away. They were gawking at him as if he was a monster, as if he was a four-eyed, bearded lady who escaped from the freak show. Tweek was the one who blew the lights. He's the one who slammed all the locker doors, and he did it without so much as lifting a finger. "How the hell did you do that?" Clyde finally spat. He was horrified, just like all the other speechless students eyeballing Tweek. He was so scared that the tears brimming in the edges of his eyes spilled over. "It wasn't me," Tweek screamed as he stumbled back. He didn't try to explain himself. He was tired of explaining. He was tired of just saying words and not being heard. They would never listen to him. They would never accept him. Not even Token and Clyde. He ran down the hall. The crowd of fearful kids split open right down the middle as he ran through them. No one wanted to be the one he bumped into. For all they knew, he could splatter them across their lockers with as much as a nod of his head. He was still racing down the locker-lined hallways when the attendant's bell rang. He hardly noticed the sound. He was too petrified by the walls closing in on him. He felt like he was being asphyxiated. Clyde of all people. Betrayed didn't even begin to describe his anguish. He didn't have a single soul left to share his pain with. What was he going to do now? How was he going to sit in his classes without prying stares? How could he survive all alone? These questions were too much for the 13-year-old to take. He ran through the then empty hallways until he came across a big red sign. It was fixed over the frame of a metal door, glowing bright with deliverance. "Exit," it read in blocky letters. Without a second thought, he pushed through it. He was met with fresh air. He breathed it in like an alcoholic sips on a bottle, but his inside still felt rotten. He staggered across the cement of the sidewalk before tripping over his own foot. A loud thump reverberated through that fresh air as he landed, but it didn't hurt. Or, it hurt like a bitch, and he was too busy flooding the sidewalk with his tears to care. His chest heaved as he sat up. Choked sobs fell from his mouth when he saw a figure standing before him, wearing nothing but an oversized shirt slathered in grime. Craig stared down at Tweek. His skin was nearly paper white, save for the red splotches at his joints. "This is all your fault," Tweek screamed. They all think I did that. They're all scared of us now, Craig. No one is ever gonna listen to us. Never." Craig didn't respond. He just stood there in a fixed place in time, staring into nothingness with his eyeless sockets. Tweek ground his teeth together. "Not even Token and Clyde will help us now," he whimpered. "Why did you have to go and get killed in the first place? You stupid ghost, say something!" Craig's brows wrinkled together. His mouth opened and closed with a pattern of speech Tweek couldn't hear. Tweek's fingers pressed into cement as he watched Craig struggle. Finally, a tiny noise slipped from between the cracks of Craig's white lips. It didn't really sound like much of anything. A small, jumbled murmur was all he could do, but he was trying. He was trying so hard. And again, Tweek's heart shattered. "I'm sorry," he muttered quietly to the phantom still opening and closing its lips. He wiped his wet cheeks with the back of his hand. "You were just trying to protect me." Craig's mouth closed. Token and Clyde may have left him broken and empty, just like everyone else, but at least he still had Craig. Or, at the very least, the shell he left behind. "Just don't ever do that again," Tweak ordered, as gently as he could manage. Craig didn't reply. Not even with a nod. Still, Tweak somehow knew he understood. When Tweak couldn't see Craig, his chest ached. Tweak walked alone through the streets on his way home from dropping off Kyle. He couldn't hear Craig's footsteps behind him. He couldn't see his little figure walking alongside him. He still felt his presence. He was there, somewhere, though Tweak couldn't see him. He sucked in a sharp breath, which only caused more tension in his already aching chest. It wasn't pain he felt. Not really. It was more like a heavy pressure. It was almost as if he grew an extra lung he didn't quite have room for. The pressure always came when Craig was away. When he stepped into the front door of his house, he came across a sight he didn't think much of. His parents sat on the living room couch, sleeping. He normally didn't come home until the early hours of the morning. By then, his parents finally gave up waiting for him to come home. Who could blame them for waiting up, really? They, like every family on the block, had a deep-seated fear that their child could be the next to vanish. However, Tweak gave his parents extra reason to be scared for him. He snuck out, and a lot. Not only did he like to disappear in the mist of the night, without so much as a goodbye, but he'd never tell the truth about where he'd been. They'd had many stern talks with him, but no amount of talking could keep the Shadow Man away from Stark's Pond. Tweak bunched his jacket up against his chest and made his way towards the stairs. He was careful to be quiet. Though this was a rare night, he was at home when they wanted him to be. He'd rather escape another concerned lecture. "You're home," he heard a groggy voice greet from behind. He turned with a jolt to find his father looking up at him from the couch. His mother, however, still sat fast asleep beside him. "Oh, yeah," Tweak uttered a little awkwardly while wringing his jacket in his hand. "I mean, you're actually at home by 9, Richard clarified with an air of awe in his voice. You know," Tweak mumbled to himself. "Decided to roam the streets and sell all my drugs early today." Richard rolled his eyes. "Haha, very funny." Tweak seemed to think so too, considering his laugh. He waved a lazy hand goodbye. Before he could put his foot on the first step, his father stopped him with more unwanted conversation. "Hey, Tweak," Richard muttered while leaning forward. "Do you think it'd be alright if I had a word with you real quick?" Tweak quirked his head. He already knew where this was going. He'd had about 1,000 interventions since Craig came back to him a mangled mess. Sometimes they'd try to get him to talk about it. Other times, they'd want to know where it was he spent all his time at night. Then, on more recent occasions, they'd ask if he was on drugs. Which, to be fair, there were nights he skipped the pond and went to Henrietta's. The Goths were gracious with their weed, and Tweak was guilty of indulging when he was too stressed. That night was different from all the rest, though. Instead of bombarding Tweak with a web of confusing questions and concerned allegations, His father calmly stood from his seat and motioned for Tweek to follow him. With a defeated sigh, Tweek did so. Richard led him into the kitchen and away from his sleeping mother, where they could talk without waking her. Richard took a seat at the table and nodded his head towards the chair across from him. "Go on, son. This isn't about your late nights out. Sit." The chair's legs groaned against the floor as Tweek pulled it out and sat down. He anxiously rubbed his muddy boots together. If it wasn't about sneaking out, it could only be about two other things. He didn't feel like talking about either. "Now, I know me and your mother talked to you plenty before about what you go through," Richard began as he tapped his fingers along the top of the table. Tweek immediately frowned. "But I felt like you and I should talk, man to man." The kitchen clock ticked a somber tune as Tweek kept his eyes down on the tabletop. It had bright splotches of yellow running across the wood. They were reflections of the ceiling lamp that shined above them. He didn't want to look up because he already knew what kind of face his father would be wearing. "I know you're living your own life, and as long as you aren't getting into trouble, I don't mind letting you live it. But maybe you should focus on the people in your life. The living people." Tweek looked up and swallowed hard. Craig had always been a bit of a taboo subject, considering the very mention of him brought up the question of their only son's sanity. He was so sure they talked about locking him up in the loony bin at least once, if not twice daily. "You don't have friends. You don't talk to me and your mother. It's like this thing you've got going on is just, well, destroying your life. It has been for a very long time." "Dad, I know how much you guys love me," Tweek began slowly. "Trust me, I know. But we've talked so much over the years, I don't know what to say anymore. Please, just talk to me," Richard begged from across the table. "I won't judge you. I won't pick at you. Tweek, I'm your father, and I need to help my son. Please." The tightness in Tweek's ribs only grew. He couldn't see Craig, but he could hear angry breathing in the shell of his ears. "Craig, chill out. We talked about this." "You won't believe me. I don't expect anyone to. I just need you to understand that it isn't going away. Maybe not ever. Yeah, it hurts and all that fun stuff. But it's a punishment I need to take." "Punishment?" Richard asked softly. His eyes changed again. They seemed softer, half-lidded as he gazed at his only child. "Tweek, you don't need punishment. What happened to Craig is not your fault." Tweek felt like he just swallowed a mouthful of cold water. His bottom lip quivered without his consent, but he remained emotionless otherwise. Richard leaned forward over the table. That worried look returned to him. "You were just a little boy," he said, as if he was begging Tweek to believe him. "There wasn't anything you could have done." Tweek swallowed down the tension in his throat. He didn't agree. He didn't believe it. A few simple words were all Tweek needed, and he didn't say them. He didn't say them. "Craig is with me now," Tweek uttered with a weak nod. "Whether or not it was my fault doesn't matter. He needs me." Tweak rubbed his aching ribs with a grimace. "Can I please go to my room now?" Richard leaned against his chair. A huff of breath escaped from his nostrils before he said, Okay. Just don't forget you could talk to me, okay? About Craig, about anything. Me and your mother, both." Tweak nodded his head, but didn't do much else but idle in his chair and clutch his ribs. "You okay?" Richard asked as he watched Tweak run his hands over his chest with a pained expression in his face. "Yeah, it's just my chest. If your ribs are hurting, we need to take you back to the doctor," his father replied. "Why? So they can tell us nothing's wrong with me again?" Tweak reasoned. "It'll pass. Always does." There were no more words exchanged as Tweak stood from the table. Again, the legs of his chair cried out against the floor. He made his way out of the kitchen and to his room as quickly as he could manage. As he ascended the staircase, the tension in his chest slowly subsided. Craig was standing in the middle of the hallway. His head was down. The dirty ear flaps of his blue hat hid the unpleasant view of his distorted face. Tweak didn't think much of it as his bedroom door slowly creaked open on its own. The lambent image of the little boy drifted into the open door, and Tweak followed. Relieved of the pinching in his torso, he gladly kicked off his boots by his bed. Craig was on the floor. His arms and legs bent and jerked awkwardly as he crawled underneath the bed frame. Tweak politely waited for the little specter to settle before crawling into bed himself. "Good night," he muttered as he pulled his thick comforter over his shoulder. Craig let out a faint growl. Don't worry. Dave's still butthurt since I threw that book at him yesterday. He'll leave us alone tonight." With that, Tweak reached up beside his nightstand and flipped the switch. The big light went out, but the nightlight plugged in across the room left a gentle glow rather than pitch dark. It almost felt weird laying down in bed and going to sleep so early, but he was fucking exhausted. "Bright enough?" Tweak questioned. Craig replied with silence, which meant yes. Hours after Tweak finally slipped away into sleep, Craig remained alert beneath him. What was left of bony fingers dug into the bottom of the box spring. The boy laid flat against it, as if gravity was lost on how to deal with him. Heavy gasps left his sore throat as his gory maw gaped open. His tiny body ached with every cracking bone and empty vein. There were many other nooks and crannies for a tiny ghost such as himself to hide in, but those dark corners and crawl spaces lacked one thing that under the bed had: Tweak. He could feel the warmth of life seeping down through the mattress and into his trembling fingers. He could hear every rhythmic thump of blood being forced through tight veins. He could hear the wisp of every breath that slipped past lax lips. He knew the way Tweak's bones ground together when he moved. He knew the clean smell of his skin, and he memorized every bump and hill that made up Tweak's face. He knew the soft lids that fluttered over his eyes. Blue, Craig thought. He thought they were blue, but he couldn't remember. He wondered if his own eyes were that color. The hard tips of his mutilated fingers found their way into his eye sockets. They scraped along the inside of the rotting holes, where he heard his fingers rub against the hardness of his skull. He cried out softly to himself in sorrow. The mattress above him squeaked as Tweak shifted in bed. He made small, sleepy sounds that made Craig's insides quiver. The little monster crawled along the bottom of the bed before poking out from under the bedspread. Branch-like arms crept up onto the mattress. They quietly pulled Craig up and onto the bed. He pressed his ear against Tweak's chest. He felt the steady rise and fall of a strong pair of lungs. He heard the heavy thumping of a gentle heart. There was nowhere safer than Tweak. There was nowhere Craig felt more comfortable. He ran his fingers over each rib until the bony tips were pressed against the softness of his stomach. Craig let out a small sound as the end of his bones pressed up against the underside of Tweak's rib cage. He was shivering cold, but Tweak was so warm. Desperate for safety, he allowed his tremulous hands to sink underneath the cage of bone that made up Tweak's torso. He could feel every hard piece of it bump along the tops of his fingers as he slid his arms in deeper. The heavily pumping blood, the comforting sound of Tweak's soft breathing, they all grew so much clearer. Tweak didn't feel it as his chest cavity popped and expanded. There wasn't a pinch when an invisible skull forced itself against the inside of his lungs. There wasn't pain when a tiny body made a bed out of his soft organs, and there wasn't a scrape when the tips of Craig's sharp fingers caressed his thumping heart. All there was a pressure, a dull, tight pressure. When Tweak couldn't see Craig, his chest ached. It was only a day later an apprehensive teenager found himself standing before the woods of Stark's Pond. The trees in themselves were daunting. They were tall, eerie pillars that obstructed any and all light. The moment he stepped past the tree line, a chilly feeling hit him, and an odd fog rolled into his mind. Those woods almost seemed to be a portal to a different world. A dreadful, sad world that devoured any sense of hope or joy. Still, Kyle stood as strong as his trembling would allow him. Wind whistled as he trudged onward through the orchid of death. At least, that's what it felt like to Kyle. The arms of dark trees leaned down to pluck at him. The soft, wet ground tried to steal his shoes as he walked forward. The darkness descended upon him like a pillow, harmless until it was being used to smother him. He was unnerved by the creaking and stirring throughout the forest, but he wasn't as afraid as he was the last time he found himself there. This time, he knew what he was doing. He knew who was there and where he wanted to go, though he wasn't entirely sure how to get there. He'd been wandering through the endless loop of woods and drooping leaves. He never seemed to get any further, but it was hard to tell the trees apart by the trunks caught in his flashlight. He tried his best to follow his gift through the eerie darkness. Sometimes it acted as an internal compass, which guided him towards those long forgotten. He didn't stop until he finally reached a particular tree. The only thing setting it apart from the rest was the bare still pinned against the wood. It was withered and old-looking thanks to the harsh elements, and some type of green moss turned the teddy's fluffy foot fibers into a new home. The irresistible urge to feel it under his fingers washed over him like ice water. He licked his lips and stepped towards it. Kenny was not there to thwart him that time. He knew before he even took hold of it what it was going to do. Tweak was given visions through his eyes. They were given to Kyle through his hands. And so, the wet and mossy paw of the teddy squished unpleasantly between Kyle's shaking fingers. Thump, thump, thump. A long, thick nail was driven through the chest of a stuffed animal. The same stuffed animal Kyle was squeezing tightly in his killer grip. The sun was shining through the trees in long beams, illuminating the back of a blonde head. Kyle was finally able to pry his rigid fingers away, but the image lingered. It seemed the Shadow Man was behind more than just Stark's mysterious holes. The Tree of Dolls seemed to Kyle like far less of a mystery. If he spent most of his nights surrounded by mischievous spirits of children, He'd probably want to appease them too, which brought him to the reason he was searching for it in the first place. His backpack slipped off the peaks of his shoulders, and he dug through it to find a toy of his own. It was something that used to belong to his little brother Ike when he was little. It was a red, stuffed car. It was more like a pillow, really, but he thought it would do fine. He kneeled down at the base of the tree. His flashlight brightened the button eyes of the stuffed animals as he set the car down amongst their ranks. He swallowed hard, then uttered a small message to whatever entities might be listening, and he knew they were. "I brought this for you, to prove I'm not here to hurt anyone." His throat felt dry as he spoke. "I just want to help Tweak." Leaves rustled as spirits swayed through the trees. Through the whimsical sound, he heard the familiar grinding of bones. It was a sickening noise he'd only ever heard one other time. He shut up and quickly backed away from the tree. Something caught in the beam of his flashlight. A small squeak of fear slipped past his lips when he saw a pale figure peeking at him through the forest. Well, it would be peeking if it had any eyes. The little spirit let out a low hiss in warning. The gaping hole of its mouth was just as pitch black as its eyes, but at least it wasn't crammed with razor-like teeth. Kyle swallowed hard and backed away. "Please, don't chase me," Kyle begged. "I'm not going to hurt you or Tweak or any of your little friends. I promise." When the disembodied hissing did not cease, Kyle felt his chest tighten up. He never encountered a spirit even comparable to that tiny creature stalking him in the woods. He didn't know what Craig really was, let alone what he was capable of. "Oh, I brought you a present," Kyle muttered in a bit of a panic. The hissing slowed when Kyle picked the car up from the tree and held it out with shaking hands. He squeezed its middle, which played some cheesy theme song for a show he never watched before. "Go, Red Racer, go," the toy chimed merrily at the peak of its song. When Kyle blinked, the mangled form that had been spying on him was standing only a few feet away. Its rotting face tipped from side to side as it listened to the melody. Tweak liked to call Craig his puppy when he'd do that, as if the decaying cavities his skull were doe eyes and pert lips. Kyle, however, wasn't blinded by unconditional love. The apparition's angered hissing was replaced by high cooing, but Kyle didn't feel any safer than he did before. On wobbly legs, the pint-sized monster staggered forward. Kyle instinctively let out a scream as long limbs exploded from Craig's back. They snatched the Red Racer plush right out of Kyle's grasp before bolting back into the darkness of the woods. He shined his light through the veil of swaying branches and leaves. That same melody chimed over and over again from somewhere amongst the trees. It echoed distortedly, which made that happy tune seem a lot less happy to Kyle. Along with the music came faint laughter. After steadily swallowing a wad of spit, Kyle followed the noise aimlessly through the thick foliage. The hope was that Craig would lead him to Tweak. There was really no other way, but he wasn't sure if tailing the giggling of a hostile spirit was the best idea he ever had. As long as Craig wasn't trying to tear him to shreds, he supposed he'd be all right. Twigs snapped and rustled beneath his shoes as he tried to keep up with Craig's noises. He got nervous when the sounds faded away, but they were soon replaced by something else completely. It was a sharp and heavy noise, like someone slamming metal into earth. He kicked up some leaves as he sprinted towards it. He came barreling out of the tree line as his light shined into an opening in the woods. A horrified shriek immediately followed Kyle's ruckus, but it didn't come from him. It came from the 6-foot-tall, hooded figure wielding a shovel nearby. The Shadow Man's first instinct was always to run. Being captured was not an option, and he'd rather be made out a coward than an idiot. So he turned away from the person who just snuck up on him and bolted in the opposite direction. "Tweak, no wait, it's me!" Kyle screamed in desperation. Kyle Broflovsky!" Tweak did stop, but he was obviously not trusting. He backed away into a bush where he had plenty of options for escape if it came to that. "What the hell are you doing here?" The cloaked figure spat with his shovel raised in defense. Kyle's hand shot up as a show of submission, then quickly yelled, "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to freak you out like that." "What? How did you even find me?" Tweak demanded. He was still partially hidden in nearby foliage, but Kyle could see him just fine thanks to the moon and his flashlight. "Craig let me here," Kyle replied with a nod of his head. I wanted to help you." Tweak slowly dropped his tool to his side and slid out from his hiding place. He didn't seem to know what to make of what he was hearing. "You came to help me," Tweak said in a voice unsure and suspicious. "And Craig was the one who brought you here?" "Well, yeah," Kyle said while fiddling with the grip of his own shovel. It wasn't nearly as long as the Shadow Man's, but it stayed put when he slipped the handle in his belt. "I brought him a stuffed animal, like the ones you nailed to the tree in the woods." "How did you know that was me?" "The teddy bear showed me." After hearing such a ridiculous thing fall out of Kyle's mouth, Tweak replied, "You really are just as fucked up as I am, aren't you?" "Well, maybe not quite as fucked up." Tweak didn't care for Kyle's jokes. "I already told you, I don't need help." In fact, he couldn't stress enough just how much he didn't want Kyle or anyone else to be there. "You aren't even going to give me a chance?" Kyle asked, while pulling his own tool off his belt. It dwarfed the Shadow Man's trusted metal companion, but it worked fine nonetheless. "I brought my own shovel, if that makes a difference." Tweak actually frowned at that. Thankfully, the shadows of his hood hid his somber expression. "Give me a single reason why I should give you or anybody else a chance," Tweak spat bitterly. Kyle could hear a shovel hit the ground again, though he couldn't see it. His flashlight was too busy scanning through the trees to illuminate the person before him. "Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm standing right here with a perfectly good shovel," Kyle replied carefully. Kyle stood for a moment as Tweak continued to drive the metal tip into the beginnings of a fresh hole. He didn't say a single word, which sounded more like an open invitation to Kyle. He came up alongside Tweak with his tool at his side and sank it down into the fresh earth. He didn't feel like he was actually accomplishing anything compared to Tweak, who was more than well versed in hole digging. However, there was only one bit of advice the Shadow Man passed on to the rookie. "Dig deep.